Welcome everyone to Ditching the Discomfort with the Data series. And this is part 3, which is working with data. I'm Nicole Shaneborn, and I have with me Dr. Hayden Center. We are with the South-Southwest Prevention Technology Transfer Center, and we are glad to have you here today. And while you are answering the poll, we did notice that many of you have attended our prior session, part 2. So we're glad to have you back. And we also see a lot of newcomers. So we will go over some of the basics with data literacy in this presentation so that you don't miss out on that information. So thanks for being here today. We also want to acknowledge that this presentation was prepared for the South-Southwest Prevention Technology Transfer Center, and we have a cooperative agreement with SAMHSA. All of the material in this publication, except for any copyrighted sources, is in the public domain, so you're welcome to use it. We just ask that you please cite the information, and that is appreciated. If you have any questions about getting copies of the publication, you can contact us at pttc6@ou.edu. And we also want to ensure that we let you know that the opinions that are in the webinar today are the view of the PTTC network and don't necessarily reflect the position of the Department of Health and Human Services or SAMHSA. We also want to acknowledge that this work is supported by our grants from SAMHSA. So thank you for being here today. So on the next slide, we have sort of a graphic of our data literacy journey. And in part 1, just to recap, we did an overview of data literacy and kind of covered some basic points of each of these steps. In part 2, which was reading data, we walked through several examples of how to look at the literature, how to appropriately look at data, what you want to look for, what things stand out to you, and we did some breakout room activities. And now we're here with part 3, which is working with data. And so today we'll talk about mostly data collection and some of those challenges that you might experience. Next on our journey, and we'll tell you at the end of today's session, we'll give you some information about part 4. We'll be talking about analyzing data and give you the registration link for that. And then in part 5, finally, we will talk about communicating data. And that's where we will cover how to present data to different audiences, what are some ways to visualize data, and a lot of those concepts. So please continue to join us in the rest of our journeys. And we look forward to talking to you today about working with data. So on the next slide, we just want to cover our learning objectives. So today we'll talk about defining what it means to work with data. We will list 2 challenges when working with online surveys or focus groups, and we'll go through those pretty extensively. We will also apply methods for working with data to an example, and that will be through our case study and our breakout rooms. And then we will list 2 ways to build your capacity around working with data and ditching the discomfort. On the next slide, our basic roadmap. It looks like a great picture, I know, for it's nice and serene, isn't it, Hayden?
It is. Wouldn't mind being there today on a hot day.
That's right. And so with that picture, we want you all to think of this as a very, step-by-step journey. Working with data can be overwhelming. And so just take the steps with us today, relax, take a breath of fresh air. Journeys with data tend to wind in and out and come back. Sometimes we have to go back to some of the steps we did before and reanalyze where we're at. So we're going to take that same approach today. So we've done our introductions, and now we're going to be talking about working with data and what it means. Then some tips for working with that data to help you through this journey. We'll do our group work in breakout rooms. And then we'll come back as a group to debrief and talk about some of the things that we found And then our last step will be to evaluate how we did today, of course. So any questions about that?
I think you did a good job explaining that, Nicole. I think everybody's ready, huh?
I think they are. I think they are. Well, let's take this journey. Before we get started, though, we need to acknowledge our wonderful supportive team we've got here. That first person you see there is me. I'm the evaluator for our team and glad to be here today with you. Derek Newby, Richard Feinberg, Sheila Boswell, Wanda West, Lori Smith, and Dr. Tremaine, our epidemiologist. We appreciate all these folks who help make today possible. A lot of the work goes on behind the scenes, and so we don't always get to acknowledge all the great expertise that goes into our services when we get out in front of people. So thank you to all our wonderful team members for making this happen today. And on the next slide, we have Dr. Hayden Center, who is here with us today. And I'll just give you a little information about Dr. Center. He was most recently on faculty at Auburn University at Montgomery in the Department of Psychology, where he taught for 10 years. He has also taught at several universities over the past 30 years. He's a licensed professional counselor and in addiction, and he's been working with addiction issues for over 30 years. It's a lot of experience, Hayden. Dr. Center has worked as a consultant in alcohol, tobacco, and other drug use. And he also has been in the field of prevention specifically for more than 30 years. He has also been the director of the U.S. Department of Education grant while at Auburn University. He has worked for the Alabama Governor's Office for 10 years and has worked with numerous state and local agencies in the state of Alabama. He also is an evaluator. So with all that, he is also an evaluator. And so he knows data, he knows science-based prevention. He understands risk and protective factors and sustainability, which he's been doing a lot of great research in. And so through all this experience, Hayden brings such expertise to walk us through how we can work with communities to talk about data. So we are very lucky to have him here today. So Hayden,
well, thank you, Nicole. It's a pleasure to be here. And I was reflecting this week as I was meeting with another group and kind of going back through the history of a project that was a little over 20 some odd years old. And I was reminded of the first time that I did a presentation on science-based prevention in the mid-90s. We called it science-based at that point in time. There was some concern about using that term, and eventually it morphed into evidence-based prevention. But just to give everybody kind of a framework for how much everything's changed in prevention. So I was sharing with the group, I would go around and make presentations on the programs and practices that were in the evidence-based at that point in time. And we had 7 programs that were part of something that became an effective practices and programs registry and repository. Well, we've come a long way, have we not?
we have.
And some of the reasons that we've come a long way is we've moved from doing prevention just kind of from the gut, from the instinct as to, well, let's do this or let's do that. We've become much more data driven in how we have looked at the problems in the community, which really leads to how do we plan effectively based on the data that we've been able to gather. How do we start to put programs and practices and strategies into place? And then how do we see if those are effective over time? And so it's become more and more important that everybody in prevention at least understands a data-driven process. Now, that doesn't mean, again, that you're going to be doing high-level statistics, but it does mean that you understand kind of the process that we go through to really gather data with integrity, to look at that data understand it, read it, analyze it, and then report it with integrity. And then that last step that we're going to talk about in our fifth of the 5 series, where we talk about, okay, now we've done that, how do we communicate that to all the people in the community and then all the other people, holders that need to know about what we're doing and the effectiveness of what we're doing. And so what I think we're doing is really core to prevention at this point in time. And so that's kind of how I look at this, is that, you know, when we talk about data literacy, ditching the discomfort with data, what we're really talking about is how can everybody that's in prevention become data driven and use data to help them solve their problems and be more effective. So data literacy, and this is the definition we've been going and been relying on since our beginning overview workshop, is the ability to read, work with, and analyze and argue with data. So when someone gives you a data report, they're telling you what exists, but you have to interpret that, and you have to be able to move that data into something that's meaningful so that you can have an effective prevention program. So we're going to talk today, and I'm not sure, Nicole, whether we've sequenced all this in the best way possible, because, you know, it's all, we kind of did some things and now we're going back and doing some things, and that's kind of how my brain works, but it's kind of how all this works anyway. You know, you do some things and then you go back and do some things, and you do some things and you go back and do some things. So we talked, you know, about learning how to read data. Now we're getting into the working with, but we also have to have a good mechanism for gathering data, because if we don't have data, then there's nothing really to read and work with. So we're kind of going back a little bit and talking about what are some really common ways to gather data and some things to be concerned about as you do that, so that we can have the best data, the best information possible. So what do you think of when you hear we're going to work with the data? And we'll give you just a moment to you know, respond to that in the chat. But, you know, work is not a word that we always have a common or a pleasant connotation for us. But what we're really talking about, you know, is how you're going to really we're going to get your feet wet in the data. You're going to start to look, well, I've got this, but then I've got this, and how did those work to, you know, how did they relate to each other, and what's going on here, and why are we having this? What other questions do I need to have answered now that I have some of the, so it's really a process where you, maybe Nicole, we the term to engage with data. Engage. But work is fine. We're not immune to work. But I think for some people, it makes it feel kind of laborsome that I'm going to actually have to do something, and kind of do something maybe I'm not entirely comfortable with the first time that I do it. So working with data involves creating, acquiring, cleaning, and managing it. And we're going to talk primarily about acquiring and managing today, but data has to be cleaned. And we've given you some resources for how to learn more about the cleaning of data. I'm not going to get into that in great detail today, but there can be errors in data input. There can be errors, you know, that come from all kinds of reasons that may make your results not as accurate as they need to be. So you go in and you look at for, and I'll use this term, Nicole, you can use another term if you think one's better, but we look for kind of outliers, meaning data, for example, that, wow, that seems like that's not in line with all the other data. And I'll just give you an example. As a lowly graduate student at Auburn University in the late 80s, we did a survey in the state of Alabama where we surveyed every 7th, 9th, 11th grader in the state, 150,000 surveys. And I'm just a lowly graduate assistant. And so we ran the data, and one of the full professors who ended up on my dissertation committee very, very fine person, said, this result is just nothing on one of the substances. It's just nothing like everything else in the literature. And I looked at it, and I was pretty familiar with the literature at the time because I had kind of been totally engrossed in it because of our grant activity. I said, no, that doesn't make sense at all. So we went back and forth, and he couldn't, and he thought. And I just happened to look at the variables, and they were reversed.
Oh.
And the fact that they were reversed means that that was inaccurate. Once we changed the order of the variables, findings were more in line with what we expected, and the findings were more in line with other prevalence surveys. So that's kind of an example of how you clean the data. So just because you have the data, you're not quite ready to do the analysis and the interpretation until you've gone through and made sure that it's as accurate as it can be. And that's what we're talking about when we're talking about cleaning data. I'll just remind you, this is not new to anyone, but I was reminded again in my meeting last week, this strategic prevention framework hasn't been in the field of prevention forever. And it was developed, I guess, around the early 2000s. That sounds weird to say that, doesn't it? But the early 2000s, and it's really a process that's iterative, and you go back and forth between these stages. And sometimes, for example, when you go to the implementation stage and you're getting early data, you may go back to the planning stage because you're not reaching the people that you thought. But sustainability and cultural competence go through each of these steps, and you should be engaging in these actions, might be a better word rather than steps, in these actions many times over the life of your project and over the life of your coalition. So you're continually assessing, looking at capacity, planning for what you're going to do, implementing, evaluating the implementation, and then reassessing and changing and increasing capacity and making new plans and implementing again, but evaluating again, and the process continues and continues and continues. But what we see is that using this structured process and being intentional makes us more likely to actually be solving the problems that exist. And that is because the data tells us this is the problem. The data tells us, and the evidence-based literature tells us these are approaches that have worked with those problems. So we plan, how do you do it in this locale, and how do you implement it with integrity and monitor that implementation? That's part of data, is what we call process data, implementation. And then how do you continue to evaluate your efforts? So always want to remember that's kind of the anchor. The planning model hasn't been around forever, but I think it added a great deal to the field when we all started talking the same language around this planning process. And data is integral to each of these stages. So what we want to talk about today, and Nicole, you feel free to jump in at any time if you have any input. Nicole and I work very well together. We're a little bit more conversational than we are slick presenters. Well, I should only say that for me. You may be the slickest presenter ever, Nicole.
Oh, no, I like to be conversational.
But so Nicole will work off of each other as we do this kind of on an as needed basis. But I do want to tell you, Nicole has a lot of experience in evaluation. And so she's embedded in your region, to be someone who can really help with that, as you saw two other evaluators, I believe, on the screen that also have a wealth of information. So we talked about in the overview, the first meeting, several data collection methods, and survey is probably the one that's used most. There's a lot of reasons for that. Surveys are in a lot of ways easier to conduct depending upon how you do them, gives you a good snapshot for what's going on. And you can kind of get an idea of kind of the larger numbers in the community kind of that represent. But a lot of times you need to understand the stories that are behind that data. And that's where focus groups can be helpful, where people come and have conversations about what's going on in the community, about what the needs are, what the concerns are, what they're seeing. Now, that data is not representative of the entire community, but it does give you a more depth picture of kind of how people are seeing things. So it can be very, very valuable information as you're doing initial assessments and your needs assessments to see what the issues are. It can be very, very valuable as you're implementing a program to see, how are people responding to it? What impact is it having on them? What concerns may they have? What do they not understand about it? Those kinds of things. And it can help you determine and help you explain your outcomes. As when people will tell you, well, this has made a real change in our community because 5 years ago you could go to this area and there were adolescents that were actively using on Friday nights in large groups here. That doesn't happen anymore because we became aware of it. We've done some things in the community. And I think I feel that my second child coming through high school is going to have a different experience than my first. Those are powerful words, are they not? And and those can be shared sometimes in focus groups or interviews. And interviews tend to be more individual. Sometimes we call those key informant interviews, which means we're interviewing people who should know something about what's going on. And that, again, gives us some more of what we call qualitative information, story type information that helps us understand many times some of the results of our quantitative surveys. And then observation, just being able to observe what's going on. I'll tell you one, just to give you an example of an observation that was made in the community, both in our needs assessment and then later in our following up on outcomes. I was working with a community, and this is this is a long time ago. I'm not even going to tell you how long it was ago, but I was working with a community that had just gotten this new thing called a Galleria Mall. And Galleria, the malls with a hotel, kind of a new concept at that time. And in this particular community, the Galleria had become, everybody wanted to go there. It was the only one in the state. So it's kind of a rural state. I hope I'm not telling you where this state is or this community, but it's okay if I am. But this Galleria, and so we were doing needs assessments and I was doing interviews with different people on the coalition. And one of them happened to be the manager of the Galleria. He had come on the coalition, he had concerns. And I just asked, well, what are you seeing? And he said, let me tell you what I'm seeing. He says, I'm seeing parents drop off their children, 9th grade, 10th grade, 11th grade, on Friday nights, and the children are leaving the car and they're unaccompanied, and the parents are thinking, I've just put my children in a safe environment. For a couple of hours, they'll walk around and then I'll pick them back up and everything will be well monitored and safe. And he says, what I'm watching these young people do is walk through the mall, go out the other doors and get into a car that's driving and drive around for 2 to 3 hours, doing whatever adolescents do when they drive around or where they're going, and then coming back and walking back through the mall and getting into their parents' car. That's an observation. Well, obviously once the community found out about it, they started doing something about it. And later on, the observation was that's not happening much anymore. And so observations can be powerful, but that's a different type of kind of data collection method. And hopefully that was an illustration that, can kind of show how you can think about these things and really get some that was meaningful data, was it not?
Mm-hmm.
To know what was happening in that particular community. I've done focus groups with adolescents that later I could tell you the places they were using and the places they were acquiring without giving any type of identifying participant data. So you can use this, data can be powerful, and it can help you do a better job if you really understand kind of how data can be used and then how it can be communicated. So Nicole, I hope all that was okay. You're kind of my monitor as we do this. Is there anything else you would add?
I would just say that I agree that, what you said about focus groups really adding some meaning to survey data. My background is in HIV, and I remember us doing a large quantitative survey and discovering that people were having some barriers with, understanding transmission and things like that, and then how to prevent that. And it was only through the focus groups that we learned really the depth of, the misconceptions that people had around how the virus was transmitted and
Right.
what we could do about that. And so it's really important to look at all those pieces together.
Yeah, absolutely, for sure. So for those of you that are participants in this, just think for a minute, what's been your experience with doing surveys, and what's been your experience with doing focus groups? And if you've done interviews or even observation, we're going to give you some tips in just a little bit, especially around surveys and focus groups. And as we do that, think about whether your experience kind of coincides with what we're presenting as some kind of important concerns as you start to gather your data. So we are in a different world, are we not?
For sure.
I was doing electronic presentations before the pandemic. I've done them for a while. I've been teaching online, entirely online, for almost 20 years. Was a little bit ahead of the curve on that. There are some real advantages to an online existence, and a lot of people didn't see that until we had the pandemic, which was an awful thing to happen for us to learn. But we've seen that there are advantages to doing things online. I take you back to that survey that we did at Auburn University in the late 80s with 150,000 students. You realize that was 150,000 Scantron sheets.
That's a lot.
And you do realize that it was the graduate student that was doing all the real work for that project. And that graduate student was me, who was going all around the state collecting these surveys, 150,000 surveys, and then making sure they were dropped off and analyzed and all that process. Well, that took a tremendous amount of effort. And now we can do online surveys, and we can get really quick data collection. I'm setting up a survey right now for a client. It took us a few weeks to kind of work it through and make sure we had everything, pilot test it, but now it's ready to go. Share a QR code, have our consent form built in. Survey takes about 5 to 6 minutes for people to complete. As soon as they complete it, it's already part of the analysis package. It's basically put into a form where I can analyze it using SPSS or one of the other analysis packages. It's all quick data collection. So it's low cost, cost efficient. And there are several platforms for doing this. I'm not going to mention any specific ones because, there are several good ones out there. Very convenient for desktop computers, mobile devices. The design flexibility, you can have people do all kinds of skips. You can have them, you can even post resources on there, like if you're asking sensitive questions, and maybe by asking that question, you could be calling up, some mental health or emotional concerns. Well, you can give them a live link right there on the survey as to, well, here, if you need some resources, or here's our hotline or whatever. So you've got all kinds of design flexibility. You have a potential for higher response rates. Although, let me just point this out. Response rates are always the concern with surveys.
Yes.
And you really want to get as many responses as you can, so it's representative of whatever subgroup or population or that you're trying to. So that there's a lot that goes into making sure that you're going to have those higher response rates, and that it's just that's something that you have to think about. What will people respond to? What will get their interest? Why is it important for them to respond? But also keep their burden low.
Mm-hmm.
If you make it where it's a very, very long survey, people will quit. Either they'll really quit and ditch the survey, or they'll stop kind of answering and just kind of, so you want to ask what you need to ask and nothing more. And you want to keep the burden very low. Pilot test it. Make sure that your questions are understandable. Only ask one question per survey item.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of problems with surveys when you ask for more than one question. That happens quite a bit with people who are just putting surveys together and don't have a lot of experience. Only ask for one question or one piece of information per item. And that's real important. You can have improved accuracy, although people can still hit the wrong button. People can go through and just take it and not really read and just get it over with. But if there's a good need for it, then most of the people hopefully will engage. There are no interviewers needed. Interviews take time and effort. Now, they provide a lot of great information, but it does take a lot more time. And then data analysis can be conducted fairly quickly. You can go through, clean the data, look for outliers, look for any other kinds of concerns, clean the data, and then ready to analyze it very, very quickly. And a lot of these platforms, you can easily download the data into an Excel format, and then Excel will can be then transported into other statistical packages if you're so inclined, and you need that for your data analysis. So a lot of advantages to online surveys. There are challenges. There are online limitations. Not everybody may have access to a device. And depending upon the data that you're gathering, now there's a lot of access, but let's say we were doing a survey with people in the homeless population. It may be more challenging, to get to recruit and to have access to online. So recruitment challenges many times. How do you advertise this? How do you get it out to people? If you're surveying members of your coalition and you send with the official cover of the coalition, we would hope most people would be engaged enough in the coalition they would respond. If you're just sending out something to the community at large about what they're seeing in the community, that's going to be more of a recruitment challenge. Why are they going to take their time and effort to respond? Now, if somebody asks them to that is influential in the community, then they're more likely to respond. And so just thinking that process through. You do have the potential for duplicate or fraudulent responses. There are ways to control for that. And that really just kind of depends upon the quality of information and how many controls you need to put in to do that. But you can, in a lot of the platforms, have it screen out something that looks like somebody has already responded if they're using the same email, for example. And then sampling. When we did the survey in 1989 in Alabama, the people that contracted with us at the State Department of Education said, the people of our state will remain unstated. The people in our state will not trust a sample. We are going to have to survey every child in the state. If we do a sample, we'll get all, well, you know what, 150,000, you don't need you can get relatively accurate information using a sampling frame if it's well put together. So I did that 150,000. Well, then Centers for Disease Control said, we really are encouraging every state to do this thing called a Youth Risk Behavior Survey, YRBS. So I set up the first sampling frame for, I guess it's going to still remain the unnamed state, Alabama. Oh, I think I said it. I'm sorry. No, this is all. But so I was tasked with setting up the sampling frame for CDC for the YRBS. We got pretty much about the same results, but we only had about 2,500 people in the sample because those that participated were chosen very, very carefully. And so, but you've got to do that. The sample has, there are people that whole career is based on building sampling frames. And so it's not as easy as you want, as you think it would be. But if you're going to, for example, report on the 5th grade at one particular school, and you want that to be representative, and let's say there's 200 students, you're going to need a big proportion of those students to actually have it be a representative sample. It's usually somewhere like for 100, it's somewhere you're going to need like 81 or 82, somewhere that number, so you might as well just survey everybody with those small numbers because it takes such a large proportion. But as the numbers get bigger, the proportion changes. And so, but you got to think about that, the sampling part, not only in your survey, but if you're going to take parts of the survey and look at it in finer detail, then the groups that you're looking at there also has to be a representative sample. That makes sense? So again, this can get fairly sophisticated, but these are some of the challenges as we start, because we did say, Nicole, did we say work with data? It's starting to feel a little bit like work now, isn't it?
Yeah.
Is it starting to feel a little bit like work to you?
Yeah, and it is work. I think that's an honest thing.
Yeah,
work
I'm going to have to
that is worth
negate my
it,
other
though.
statements.
Right.
I'm going to have to get, engaging's not enough. You're going to have to work. Sorry, tried to make it more friendly for you. Let's engage first and then work with, because you really have to think through a lot of these things. So it's not as easy a process sometimes as people think about. And the poor guy here that is in the, I mean, Nicole, have you ever been in this mode before?
I definitely have, especially as I get older and my eyesight gets worse. I start doing this, but
yeah. What am I going to do with this? It's
right.
But it is a challenge. But let's go back to, and again, this is a really good way to gather data. And again, it's cost efficient. It will give you that overall snapshot. And with the technology, you're just going to reach more people. You're going to get quicker results, and it's going to be easier to analyze. You don't have to input really any data. The person that's taking the surveys input it for you.
And that's such a relief.
Oh gosh.
Thinking about the days, even when you had to mail in all the surveys and someone had to enter them. And we recently had an aha moment that we're so glad that we've got online surveys, because if a change has to be made in a survey, for example, really quickly and then back out, you would have, if you were doing in-person surveys, you would have had all this paper that would have just gone to waste. But now we can just make a change. We can send out the QR code and it's all fixed with very minimal cost to the organization. So that's another benefit.
Absolutely. Well, thank you for that. That's an important benefit for sure. So again, but we always have to think about the challenges of anything that we do, so that we can, have data that we have a high degree of confidence in. So as you're thinking about any survey that you may put together, one of the ways that evaluators, I don't know if you would agree with this, Nicole, but evaluators tend to think a little differently sometimes than other people that are in prevention. And I'm always thinking about, one of the questions that I will always ask someone that I'm working with and have just taken on an evaluation project, I ask them, what would you like to see in the final report? because if we start to know what the questions we want answered in that final report, then we plan backwards to make that happen.
Mhm.
And so it's important to think about, what do you want out of this survey? What's the reason for doing it? What kind of information are you hoping to gather? And what are your stakeholders, constituents going to be concerned about? What is going to be valuable information? So you think about all that, and then, what's your target population? Who are you really focusing this on? What questions will you ask? And again, I've already told you a very, very important principle for questions. One item, one question. And one of the things I should have said, Nicole, because I think by everything I've said so far, everyone would assume I'm talking surveys are only about quantitative data, but you can add qualitative
Mhm.
items to your survey. Makes it harder to analyze because you don't get a set response, you get different responses. Then you have to look at themes and so it takes more on the analysis part of it. But it's not a bad idea to have what I call a mixed method survey, where you have several quantitative items, but you also ask some qualitative information, that may give you a better understanding of how people responded to some of your quantitative items. It's not going to be the same depth as a focus group or an
Right.
interview, but it can give you some qualitative data that can be very, very helpful. Again, think about burden. Think about how will people be taking this. It's easier to type on a computer than it is on a phone, with long kind of, although some people with their text, I think, are probably quite good at answering long items on a phone. And then what survey software will you use? And again, there are numbers out there that I think are very, very affordable at this point in time, depending on the information that you need. You may have to pay more for certain options that you may not need. So look at it. Sometimes it costs more depending on the number of respondents that you're going to have. So, that's kind of a whole process that you go through.
Mhm.
Nicole, can you think of anything else we need to say about surveys and online surveys and advantages, limitations, concerns?
I think that, there are so many tools out there, like you said now, that it's really accessible now for folks to use online survey tools.
Yes.
Google Forms, I believe, is still free. And then there's your more advanced ones like Qualtrics and SurveyMonkey that do have a cost, although I think SurveyMonkey does even have a free trial if there's going to be a certain number of participants.
Right.
So there's a lot of options out there. And it's so much more cost effective than a
Yeah.
focus group. So if there are
Right.
just a couple qualitative questions that you need to ask, you can always add those, like Hayden said, as an
Yeah.
open-ended question to your survey.
Absolutely. Yeah, I think that's a good summation, Nicole. I appreciate that. So we're going to move forward and talk about another method of gathering information. This is a focus group, and probably all of you know about focus groups. Nicole, I first conducted focus groups back in the late 80s. I was trained by the Centers for Disease Control to do needs assessment focus groups in the HIV
Oh, I didn't
population.
know that.
Yeah, so I
Cool.
got to go up to Schenectady, New York in January.
Oh, that sounds cold.
Yes, very cold. So I was very motivated to stay inside and learn as much as I could about focus groups. And we went through a whole training and then follow-ups, and it was really the first time I had been exposed to focus groups and learning about, the role of the facilitator and kind of, how you ask the question, you don't lead the respondents, and, a lot of those kind of methodological issues. But I found that I was getting stories that I never could have gotten by just surveying.
Yeah.
and learning in this particular project how HIV was impacting the lives of those that were suffering and everything they were experiencing. And it woke up for me that there's other ways to gather data, because I was primarily trained in quantitative data methods, and learning about qualitative kind of opened up a whole new world for me. In that, we need to know these stories. We need to have this depth. So it's a qualitative research method, which means people say things, and what you're looking for when you do a focus group. And I get really excited about our fourth session, Nicole. Not as excited as I do about the fifth session, because I love turning data into something that's meaningful and then communicating it. But this analyzing the data becomes real important. And what you're looking for in a focus group, just to kind of give you a forecast of what we'll talk about in the next session, is you want to do enough where you're starting to hear the same thing over and over and over again. And in that redundancy, it starts to tell you, well, this seems to really what at least a lot of people are observing, or how they're reacting to a certain situation. So it's a discussion focused on a particular topic or issue. You many times handpick the participants rather than, with a survey and a quantitative method, we're hoping everybody in the group will participate. And many times it's anonymous who's participating. So we don't even know, but we hope we've targeted the right population, and those are the people that are participating. We might handpick people in focus groups. We certainly, when we did the AIDS groups years ago, we handpicked people that had already publicly acknowledged that they were suffering with AIDS, to kind of gather information so that we could build resources that would be supportive in communities and start to look at stigma and all of those kinds of issues that were associated there. And it is facilitated by a discussion moderator. And there are resources that can train you about how to be a discussion moderator. The art is to ask the questions, ask the follow-ups, generate a lot of good discussion, get as much participation as possible without guiding it in a certain way. And it's such a tendency that we want to guide it in a certain way. And so I've had people I've supervised doing focus groups, and we really work on, okay, that question, let's modify it a little bit. That's not quite as open-ended, I think, as you hoped. So there's some training that goes along with that. Also, I think sometimes people are going to be a little bit more open and honest if they that you are independent, at least somewhat, from the organization that's gathering the information, especially if it's around sensitive topics. But again, you do the best you can with what you have. And it really, again, depends upon the purpose of your focus group, kind of how you set that up. But these are kind of the main elements of a focus group. So as I've talked about, why do a focus group? Well, to gain a deeper understanding of a particular topic or issue. I'll tell you how this worked in one community that I worked with. We did one of those national surveys that you can pay pay a group to do, and they send you the surveys and you get them done, and you send them off, and then they send you a report. I always redo the reports because I have my own style. Plus, that's part of my working with data. I didn't gather it. I didn't necessarily analyze it, but I'm going to rework it until I understand it, and I'm going to interpret it in a way that I think is meaningful. And that's part of my process. But we a survey, and so I presented the results to the coalition, and they started asking questions. Well, what does this mean? Or this is surprising, and what's going on here? And my response was, I don't know, but I do think we might be able to find out. What would you think about if we ran some focus groups and we started to ask some of these questions to see what might be a deeper understanding? So I conducted 12 focus groups at the high school. large high school, and ask the questions. And afterwards, then put those results with the survey results. I think we had a pretty good picture of what was going on in the community. In fact, I think we knew where the camping trips were happening. A lot of these adolescents were big outdoors people. They love to go camping on Friday night in large fields. And they like to have a lot of other campers with them. And it seems like those campers were all imbibing in certain substances. And so, confidentially, anonymously, we put all those reports together and people could see what was actually happening in the community.
Mhm.
They could actually see the couple of retail outlets that were not paying as much attention as they should to the legal drinking age. They were able to understand the of having a certain university being close in proximity to the high schools and the relationships of people going to the university and those that were acquiring alcohol in the community. Those are just some findings that we didn't get on the survey, but boy, we got them in the focus groups. And, after 12 focus groups, I was hearing the same thing every time. Well, we started to gain some confidence in that. So it's often used, again, to gain that deeper understanding, supplement other research methods, which hopefully I've given you at least an example of how I've used it there. But it's not intended necessarily to reach a consensus. It gives you more information. It may even give you more questions. But I've found it to be a very, very useful tool to do needs assessments, to do planning, to look at implementation and how is implementation working or not working, and then explains your outcomes, or sometimes explains why you didn't achieve certain outcomes. So focus groups, I think, have a great value. Now, there's several different types: online, telephone, traditional, face-to-face, in-person. I'm going to have to be honest with you. I've done a lot of traditional face-to-face, in-person groups. My next endeavor, online folks. So I've done a couple of those so far. I didn't know how I would like doing an online focus group, but there are advantages to doing them. And I have a project now that I'm going to do several. So I'm going to learn even more, but doing a few pilot, I've seen that online focus groups can work, but they are different. And so we're going to talk a little bit about the advantages to online focus groups. First of all, people don't have to drive anywhere, show up anywhere. So there are no geographic constraints. So if you're doing something over a large county, for example, or a state or a region within a state, you have access to people without them having to drive in. There's a reduced cost for travel, facility rental, even transcription. It is so beautiful. Nicole, have you ever tried to transcribe a focus group result?
Yes, I have. And I
Word
love,
for word?
right. It's a monstrous task. And then, you have to make sure that how you're transcribing agrees with someone else. And so
Yes.
often two people have to transcribe to make sure there's agreement. And so it's quite a task. Zoom is great for that.
Because guess what? You can capture a transcription as you go, and that makes a difference. Now, I'm going to have to be honest with you. I've only transcribed a few focus groups because I don't have that patience. So I always had to hire somebody to do the transcribing, someone, court reporter or whatever, that was skilled in doing that, because it took lots and lots of my time and I wasn't as accurate probably as I needed to be. It also has increased comfort for participants. They can do it from their preferred location. As already mentioned, option for automatic generation of transcriptions. And it's more convenient many times for researchers. Like if you're going to provide an incentive, then you can, have the link to an online gift card for someone. So it really has a lot of advantages. And I think we're going to see a lot of online focus groups. We've learned through the pandemic around telehealth, that we can do some things we didn't think we could do through distance. There's always going to be limitations to whatever approach that we use, but these are some of the advantages that we see with this. There are some challenges again: internet access, familiarity with technology. It's always fun because I use distance technology all the time for presentations and for teaching purposes. And it's always fun right before you're doing something, someone texting you, I can't get into the room, or it's telling me I need this, or I've got what happened today, Nicole and Wanda, as I was getting ready to come into the Zoom today, Zoom decided I needed to update.
Oh, no.
I didn't think I needed to update. I was quite happy. But Zoom said I needed to, and it wasn't going to let me do anything until I did. And so that made me almost late for our meeting today. So, some people are not going to be all that familiar with the technology, and that could be a limitation. There may be limited or no nonverbal communication or visual cues. When you do a live focus group, you're kind of always watching and listening, and you may even have a co-facilitator. In fact, it's better if you can. It's not always possible. And sometimes they're watching the nonverbals and saying, hey, wait a minute, I saw this. I saw you have a reaction to that. Could you tell us, what's going on? That's probably going to be a little more limited, as well as, I don't know how all of you have experienced the bonding using distance technology. I think you can get to know people, you can express yourself, but it was kind of nice last week to have a live meeting with three-dimensional people. I hadn't done that in a while. It was a little awkward at first because everybody's been two-dimensional in my life for a long time. But, so it's going to be a little bit different there. And so it may be a little more challenging for moderators. But again, I think you can overcome the challenges, and I think you can get some very, very valuable information. So just to kind of sum up, if you're going to do a focus group, this is the planning process. Develop a focus group protocol, recruit a skilled moderator. And it's usually better, again, if you can use a skilled moderator than, the person who's directing the project. Just say, I'll get some people together and get some info. Well, that's, not as good, obviously. Set a reasonable timeline, because you're going to have to recruit to put a lot of these, what we've talked about, in motion. Determine criteria for and target number of participants. You may need to over recruit a little bit. Focus groups that get too large, you're going to limit the information, or limit the participation. And by limiting the participation, it may limit the information. If you get too few people in a focus group, might be a lot of pressure on people to talk, and so there's kind of a happy medium, but you might want to over recruit by just a couple, to make sure you don't want the numbers big, but to make sure you have enough. Develop a clear recruitment strategy and then select an online platform. And some of the recruitment strategies, again, when we're sampling, for example, for quantitative, we many times, want people to be randomly selected out of a lot. Well, we don't do that. Again, we may use a snowball approach, which means that we know a few people that we ought to talk to, but as we recruit them, we may ask them, do you know some more people that may know this? And they give you this, and you snowball it. And that way you build, a group of people who kind of know what they're talking about. So there's different ways to do it. You may have a list of people, and you may want the people who participated the most in the organization. So you may, choose those people off the list, try to recruit them first, because they're going to have more of the information that you want. So there are all kinds of ways to do it, but this is the process that we suggest you undergo. So now we're moving in kind of the working part. I said that word again. The engage and working part of dealing with data. And we're using the same case study we've used all the way through the process. Community X Coalition's been meeting for about a year. They're working on developing more methods for collecting data about the local problems, risk factors, and protective factors. So they decide to gather data from 3 different sources. They do a survey of all the 8th, 10th, and 12th graders in the school system. And a lot of times, again, when you do a local survey, you may have, let's say you have 2,000 students that are eligible to be surveyed. But if you're going to break it down by groups, in class, you're going to probably need to survey everybody so that you don't run into those sampling issues that I talked about. Again, when it gets larger than that, you may want to think about a sample. Then they decided to do focus groups with parents to get their views on the issues in the community, and then key informant interviews with law enforcement and school personnel. So those were the 3 sources of data. So as you go into your groups, this is just a snapshot of some recently gathered data through the Monitoring the Future survey. We're just providing it for you so you can look. This would be some of the information you might get if you do what's called a prevalence survey. What we really want you to do as you go into your group, though, is think about, okay, if we had this data and we wanted to add some survey items, what survey items would we add? What would we think would be important? And how would we ask those questions? Just to kind of get you to thinking about how would you want to gather the data? What data would you want to gather? And how would it be useful to you? So in the breakout, you're going to look at a survey, review the data that was collected previously, and then think about what additional information do you want on your survey? Risk factors, demographics, etc. And then as you think through that and think, this is kind of getting towards your survey goals here. We want to know more about the risk and protective factors. Maybe we want to know more about the demographics of use here. And then provide 3 sample items for your survey that will answer important questions not provided in the original data. Now, you would probably end up writing many questions. We don't have all that much time. So we're going to ask you just to go through this process and to do 3. And then hopefully those can be reported out after our breakout time. And then in the focus group part, what type of information now? You've got some data. Again, not extensive data, but some data points. What type of information would you like to gather in your focus group? Who would you want to include in your recruitment of participants? And then provide 3 example items that you would use in your focus group. So again, this is just to get you active here. Start to think about the data. Think about what you have. Think about what you want to know. And this part now is for you to think about what you want to know and to start that process. So we're going to take a few moments, I think, and let everybody, well, more than a few, 15 or 20, for people to think through this. So introduce yourselves in the small group, note your group number, do your introductions, Reader's Digest version of your introduction. We'd like to get through those before we come back. Designate a facilitator and recorder, look at the data report, answer the breakout questions for parts 1 and 2, and then it's been provided where you can record those responses in Google Doc. So I think now, Nicole, we're going to go ahead and go to those breakouts. Do you have any words of wisdom, instruction, or correction to make at this point?
No, that all sounds good. We also have posted the document in Word and chat in case the Google Doc isn't working for you. So you will have that handout as well. So, and again, all these resources will be available to you later as well. So
good. Well, thank you. I think we will just let it go to breakouts then.
Yeah.
All right. We'll come back in a moment.
All right.
All right. So everybody's had a chance to hopefully have a positive experience, kind of working a little bit with some data, looking at what they already had gathered, and then trying to determine what else they needed to know. And as thinking about what else they needed or wanted to know, to really kind of start to put that into actual items that would gather that information. And so that was your task. And I don't know, Nicole, do we have any responses from anybody that we're able to share?
We do.
Okay.
So Derek's group mentioned in terms of additional information they would like to know on the survey part, the quantitative piece, that looking at the vaping data, that was a significant increase from 2018 to 2019, but there wasn't a lot of information available on, it was just in the past month or past year, I believe. And so they suggested asking in the past 30 days, are you currently vaping, to get a little bit
Okay.
more recent data.
They want some more precise data about the usage.
Right.
Absolutely.
And then they also suggested asking more risk and protective factor data. So a lot of the data focused on, consumption, things like that. So they wanted to know a little bit more about the risk factors, and also about what were the parental attitudes toward particular substances. So
that's pretty important, I think, for sure. That gets into risk and protective factors.
Yes, it does. Yeah.
Absolutely.
So those were some of the things they mentioned. And a protective factor, what opportunities were available at the school, including activities after school that can be a protective factor. So things like that. So digging a little deeper into the data. So that was some of the things they mentioned for the quantitative piece. And then for the qualitative, which was part 2, they had some things also that they mentioned. See if I can find those. Just asking more like deeper questions about the availability, where are they accessing these substances? How are they getting access to vaping, and how are they getting that paid for? What are some things where they could intervene? So a lot of those questions around that, and then digging deeper into the parental attitude issue and maybe parental monitoring, asking, if their parents know what they're doing, and how they would feel about it. So a lot of those feeling questions get to that deeper layer of parental attitude. So those are some examples of what they thought they might add to both the survey and the focus group.
Nicole, this just kind of reinforces my idea that when you let people work, they do work productively. And I didn't know how this would turn out, but I think everybody did exactly what I hoped, in that they started to think about this data and started to work with it, see what they understood, but then see what else they wanted to know. And they generated items that I think would start to get at that. I think it's kind of cool.
Yeah, it is. And it ties back to the SPIF approach, so that they know more about what they need to do, so they're not implementing programs that don't make sense. So.
Exactly. So, wow, it's always good when the participants make you look good by actually doing what you ask and doing it at a high level with high level of quality. So, I hope that as we've done this, we've given just kind of a snapshot of how you work with data, and how it's a real thinking process. It starts with gathering it and thinking through that process, because you really need good data to analyze. And so thinking through the process of how you'll gather the data, making a plan, then as you acquire the data, making sure that you clean it, that it's accurate, that it has integrity. The next time we meet in August, we're going to talk about how do you analyze it? How do you start? I call analyzing it making sense of the data. How do you take the data and look at trends and look at patterns so that you start to have an understanding of what's going on. And then in our last workshop, which the date is yet to be determined, but sometime in the fall, once you've been through this process, how do you communicate those results in a way that are going to be timely and in a way that are going to be influential in helping people understand what's going on in the community?
Exactly.
So I think, Nicole, we have gotten to the point that we had hoped to get.
Mm-hmm.
We have talked about what we wanted to talk about with working with data, engaging with it and gathering it and setting ourselves up for the next part of the 5-part series where we're going to analyze it and then communicate it. So I guess I'm going to turn it over to you and let you see if there are any additional questions.
Sure. So if you have any additional questions, you can post them in the chat. You can also email me and I'll provide that later. So we can figure out what we need to do differently next time, or questions that you have even around analyzing data, about today's presentation, all the above. So feel free to put those in the chat and we'll just keep moving through this. So on the next slide, just wrapping up, we have talked about data literacy now, parts 1, 2, and 3. So we've done our overview, we've done our reading data, and now our working with or engaging with data, as Hayden said. So on the next slide, we have our little graphic, and so we will be focusing on analyzing data next, and then communicating data. So we hope you continue with us on this journey. And on the next slide, I think we've got our registration information. We will also be sending that out via the newsletter and our constant contact. So look out for that. It will also be on our website. So we will see you in August. And then on our next slide, we have some additional resources that you can take a look at. And again, you will be getting these PowerPoint materials, so you'll be able to look at those and click on those. So don't feel like you have to write those down. And on the next slide, we of course have our evaluation. So please make sure you evaluate today's service. Our data is extremely important to us. And finally, on our last slide here, there's my contact info. If you have questions about anything today, please feel free to email me at nicoled@ou.edu. And we also have information on getting on our mailing list, accessing our website, and accessing our products and resources below. So we thank you all today for being here with us, engaging with the data. And we look forward to seeing you on August 30th so that we can talk about analyzing data.